Hello and welcome to Tenant Action Today, brought to you by Met Council on Housing, the citywide tenants union, and also brought to you by Manhattan Neighborhood Network through the miracle of modern remote technology. My name is Michael McKee. I'm a member of Met Council on Housing. I'm also the treasurer of the Tenants Political Action Committee. On this program, we're going to be talking about something called Honda. That's not an automobile. It's a piece of legislation that was recently passed by the state Senate and the state Assembly and is awaiting action by Governor Andrew Cuomo. It stands for Housing Our Neighbors with Dignity Act. And what it does is that it provides a mechanism to convert obsolete office buildings and, more importantly, hotels that are probably never going to come back on the market as hotels into permanent affordable housing for low and moderate income New Yorkers. It's a statewide bill. The legislature and the governor have appropriated $100 million, which is not a lot of money, will not pay for a lot of conversions. But as you will see, this is, we hope, going to be seed money, and we'll be able to get a lot more money, including some federal funds, into this program next year. Our first interview will be with State Senator Michael Gianaris of Queens. Mike Gianaris is the Deputy Majority Leader in the State Senate, which is the number 2 job. He has been a great friend of tenants, enormously helpful to the tenant movement in terms of passing legislation. Senator Mike Gianaris, welcome to Tenant Action Today.
Thank you, Mike.
So you've had quite a session this year. We didn't get everything we wanted, but there were some very significant accomplishments. Most notably, you raised taxes on the rich after years and years of not being able to do that because of opposition from the governor. You appropriated $2 billion for undocumented workers, almost $2.5 billion to help pay back rent and back utilities for tenants who've been impacted by COVID and haven't been able to pay the rent. And you won enactment of Honda, which stands for Housing Our Neighbors with Dignity Act. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been quite 3 sessions. As you know, since we took the majority, it's made all the difference in the direction of our state. I sometimes wonder about folks like you who have been leading for so long in the wilderness when the Republicans were in charge, how gratifying this must be to see all these wish list items start to come true.
It has. I just wish we could get good cause eviction done, but
there's still some unfinished business.
Right, that's the problem in the other house mainly. So tell us about Honda. How did you win this? Did you have a lot of opposition internally? How did you get it across the finish line?
Well, let's talk for a second about what it is, right? So we have had an affordable housing crisis in our state for decades, as you well know. And because of the horrors of the pandemic, one of the byproducts of it has been that commercial properties, hotel properties especially, because people weren't coming to the city, we were in lockdown, are basically in distress, financial distress. Many of them are up for sale. And we had the idea of marrying those two problems and saying, well, if there's properties that are available, if there's people that need housing, why don't we purchase those properties, hand them over to nonprofit developers and supportive housing developers, to turn them into residential facilities so that people who are housing stressed or even homeless will have a place to live beyond just the awful shelter system. This would be a pathway towards permanent housing.
So some of these hotels are never going to reopen as hotels. I assume that, we're staying away from taking over hotels where there are union jobs and where the hotels are viable. But there's a lot of hotels built in all sorts of weird places that probably are never going to open again.
Well, there's been a hotel rush in this city for the last several years, and I see it out here in my part of Queens. Like every corner seems to have another hotel on them. You wonder how they're filling them all, and certainly in the current environment, they're not. And so the idea was let's grab some of those properties while they're available, and let's turn them into the kind of housing we always dreamt about. The city has been on this awful approach to so-called affordable housing, where they give developers millions and millions of dollars in benefits and then hope to get 20-25% of a building that's otherwise luxury development set aside for affordable units. Those affordable units are usually set at an income level that's out of reach for most New Yorkers, so it's not really affordable. And what we're proposing is a completely new model where you have permanent, really affordable housing run by nonprofits. So it wouldn't be the luxury model where we end up getting a couple of crumbs off of the table.
Right, and some of the office buildings are old or obsolete, so converting them to housing makes a lot of sense. So there was $100 million for this put into the state budget. How many units do you think you calculate that might result in converting to housing? What are we talking about at the university?
It all depends on the particular property, how much it sells for, what type of conversion is necessary. So, for example, a hotel is a lot easier to convert because all the units already have bathrooms, for example, as opposed to a commercial property, which doesn't have that in place and require a lot more work to develop properly.
And you don't have...
so it depends, but I think what we all agree on is $100 million is not near...
Yeah.
Right, exactly. What we can all agree on is $100 million is not nearly enough to do the job. The idea was it's seed money, get the program started,
right.
Let the agencies figure out how to administer this, and then hopefully we'll get as much as $2 billion available in federal housing aid that we think could go to this purpose. And then we also have next year's state budget to supplement it even further. But the $100 million is just... you'd get several hundred to a couple thousand units, depending on the scenario. But that's not the goal. The goal is to put billions of dollars into a program like this through federal aid and additional state aid that will really make a dent in the problem.
I read a couple of days ago that the state of California has just put aside $6 billion for taking over hotels and commercial buildings and turning them into permanent housing.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer, and everybody should want this. The people who own the property should want it because they don't know what to do with them now. And we have been looking for the opportunity to develop a proper affordable housing model in the city for such a long time that this is a great opportunity to do it.
So this would get away from the congregate shelter model where you put homeless people into barrack-style accommodations where they're sleeping on cots in a room with 20 or 200 other people.
And as you well know, Mike, a big part of the street homelessness issue that we have is that these are people that don't want to go in shelters because they're so awful. And so if you have a shelter system that nobody wants to go to, it's not going to be very effective. So this would create permanent, affordable housing for these folks, including supportive services that will help them get back on their feet and stay on their feet permanently.
Yeah, it just makes a lot of sense. Now, I assume there's been some discussion between you and the legislature and the governor's office about this. Do you think the governor is going to sign the bill? And will they implement this? Will they actually move forward doing this? Or do you think they might sit on the money the way sometimes governors do?
Well, Mike, you may be assuming too much. The Assembly worked with us in the Senate at the end of session to get that language together and put the details on the program. The governor wasn't terribly involved at that point. But he did sign off, of course, on the $100 million allocation that was in the state budget. He had proposed in January his own approach, which we assume was the typical model of subsidizing luxury developers and having them provide some level of affordable housing. But we know that hasn't worked in the past, and that's not the way forward. Hopefully he sees the wisdom in what the legislature has proposed, and we get his signature on that bill.
Right, and this is a departure from the congregate shelter model where this is what the city has been doing. You put, 20 to 200 people in the same room, sleeping on cots, no privacy, no security, you can't even sleep at night from what I've been told. And this would actually put people in real housing.
Yeah, we've been knocking our heads against the wall for many years, wondering why we haven't been able to make a dent in the homelessness problem. And the reason is we keep doing things that we know don't work. The approach to affordable housing we've taken so far, relying on luxury developers, doesn't work. And the shelter system doesn't work. The reason you have such a big street homelessness issue is because these are people that don't want to go to the shelters. They are so undesirable that people would rather sleep on the street or in the subways in many instances. What we're proposing here, we have a golden opportunity to really transform the approach we're taking, and for the first time in a long time, have some optimism about helping solve this problem. And that lies in creating permanent affordability for people who are housing stressed and giving them supportive services in the building that they need to get on their feet and stay on their feet.
Right. And to solve this problem once and for all.
That's the hope.
Yeah, $100 million is, I assume, a down payment. I just noticed a couple of days ago, I read that the state of California has allocated $6 billion to expand their program, which is already underway, of taking over hotels that are no longer useful as hotels and converting them into permanent low-income and moderate-income housing. So I assume the plan is to expand this in New York.
Yeah, the $100 million is seed money in essence. It allows us to get a program up and running, begin to purchase properties, see how that's working in the first couple of instances where we can do it. But we're hopeful that there's upwards of $2 billion in federal aid during the COVID pandemic that was given to us for housing purposes that we might be able to use. And then as we roll into next year's state budget, we'll have another crack at increasing the allocation as the program grows.
Right. And do you think the governor is going to sign this bill? Have you had any discussion?
I'm sure hopeful. This is something the Assembly and Senate agreed upon overwhelmingly. We both have supermajorities, so if it comes to it, we can always get to that point. We haven't had to yet, and hopefully the governor just agrees with the approach we've taken and signs it, so it won't come to that, but that is an option available to us should the need arise.
I would think that the governor would take notice of the fact that this bill has very widespread support, including from many labor unions, including the Hotel Trades Council, which represents people who work in hotels, 32BJ, which also represents people who have some of these jobs, the United Federation of Teachers. There's very widespread support for Honda.
As far as we can tell, Mike, the only people who have concerns about the approach we're taking are the big real estate developers who otherwise would be taking advantage of a state subsidy. This money is not going to them. It's going to nonprofit developers and supportive housing providers. And so you're right. Labor is supportive. Both houses of the legislature are supportive. The advocacy community is incredibly supportive. And I don't see why this would not be the approach we would take. Hopefully the governor sees that wisdom.
Okay. Senator Mike Gianaris, thank you so much. Good work.
Thanks so much, Mike. Great to be with you.
Next, we're going to talk with Sam Stein, who is a housing policy analyst at the Community Service Society, CSS for short. CSS was instrumental in developing this legislation and in pushing it through the state legislature. Sam Stein, welcome to Tenant Action Today.
Thanks so much.
And congratulations on Honda. This is a great victory.
Yeah, thank you. We're really excited about it.
Tell us how this came about. Where did the idea come from?
Well, it's something that other cities have been doing already. The idea of converting empty commercial properties into permanently affordable housing and really emphasizing hotels, which took a real hit during the pandemic and are already set up pretty close to an apartment. So California has been doing this at a fairly large scale. There are also programs in Oregon and Vermont, and groups like Vocal and others that are organizing, homeless New Yorkers especially, but also tenant organizations, thought, this is a real opportunity. And we in New York City had already been housing homeless folks in hotels as emergency shelters, but we know that shelters aren't the solution to homelessness. Permanent housing is. And so we looked at the situation in New York State. We looked at what was being done in other cities, and we designed a program that we thought could work.
Right. And so this bill actually passed. Was there a lot of opposition in the lobbying in the Senate and the Assembly?
It's never easy. It's never easy to do a few things, to create permanent housing for the homeless. It's not easy to create a strong program for tenants that has no place for for-profit developers and that produces no luxury housing. And so, yeah, there was concern, all sorts of things. So some people thought this was creating more shelters. We had to disabuse them of that fact and say, no, this is about permanent housing, the real solution to homelessness. Some folks were concerned that this would be a zoning override, that it would get rid of the city's ability to decide what gets built where. There was some regulatory relief built into one draft of the bill, but that didn't make it into the final one, and all along it was never a zoning override. We also had to show that this had the support of the hotel workers union, who saw this as, as part of a just transition at a time when a segment of the hotel industry is going through a hard time. So there was a lot of lobbying that had to be done, but ultimately the success was overwhelming.
Right, and the Hotel Trades Council did support the bill, played a very constructive role. It's a great union, and they certainly care about ordinary people. And some of these hotels are never going to reopen. I mean, we've had sort of a glut of new hotel construction, especially in New York City, in the last several years. In all sorts of odd, out-of-the-way places.
Right. So these hotels were maybe not even going to make it anyway, and certainly the pandemic put them over the edge. A lot of the new hotel construction was in these out-of-the-way places, as you said, in part because of a quirk in the zoning code that allows for new hotels to be built in manufacturing districts, which isn't a great place to have hotels. It wasn't great for the manufacturers either, but it's where they could get away with it. And a lot of these new hotels were non-union, so they weren't providing good living wage jobs. And the hotel industry, like healthcare, is one of these ones where there's a real extreme difference between union and non-union working conditions and compensation. So this was a way, if those hotels were going to go out of business anyway, to make something constructive out of it. And the Hotel Workers Union, the Hotel Trades Council saw that.
Right, and played a really great role. 32BJ was also very helpful. I understand they, of course, represent people who have some of these jobs, and certainly in non-hotels. But what about office buildings? Now, that's a little more difficult because we have a lot of obsolete office buildings in New York City, but it's harder to make that into housing because the windows are all, on the external walls. You don't have individual bathrooms and things like that you've got in hotels. But I mean, is this going to actually work in obsolete office buildings, you think?
Maybe. We wanted to write the legislation so that it could. If there's a building that is set up, perhaps one that at some point transitioned from residential to office, that might be easier to switch back. We wanted to make it possible. But in most cases, it is very expensive to convert an office into anything but an extremely large apartment. We thought maybe that's a good thing, since these hotel rooms are going to be fairly small, probably for single individuals, maybe a couple, but not for larger households. We thought maybe the office buildings could offer an opportunity for bigger apartments. In all likelihood, though, the vast majority of the conversions we're going to see are in hotels, not in office buildings.
And that will be available to single people as opposed to families. It'd be hard to fit a family of 4 into a hotel room.
That's right. I mean, you could combine rooms. So you could, depending on the layout of the hotel, you could break down a wall or put in a door and turn 2 hotel rooms into a 2-bedroom apartment. Mm-hmm. It was extremely important to the homeless advocacy groups, especially, that this not create, bad housing that will warehouse poor people. And so we put into the law that there has to be at least a kitchenette in every apartment, as well as a private bathroom. Some of the nonprofit developers were concerned that this might make it more expensive to do the conversions, which surely is true, but at least we know that it provides a good living condition. And so if you combine 2 of these rooms together, you have a private bathroom, you have a private kitchen, you could have a good situation for a slightly larger household. You could actually make one of the 2 bathrooms into a kitchen, actually. Right, so, that's right. It's already fit for running water and everything else. What do you anticipate the number of units that we're talking about? Of course, this is
$100 million. It's not a huge amount of money. Senator Janaris, who's the lead sponsor in the Senate, has described the $100 million as seed money. But if we just have $100 million to spend right now, what does that translate to in terms of the number of apartments?
It probably means one or two hotels. In New York City, given the prices, that's about what it would do. And the idea with Honda is the money and the program is there for acquisition and renovation. And then we need other funding to run it as affordable housing, just like we do with every other affordable housing program. But it's also possible that $100 million could be bridge funding on top of several other funds, and that it's not that $100 million is the only money that goes into the acquisition and renovation, but it's the extra money that gets a few projects over the top. And once they take that money, they have to fit the guidelines of Honda, which says 50% set aside for homeless folks, the rest for low income, rent stabilized housing, and all the rest.
And it's going to be permanent affordable housing. It's not temporary.
It's not temporary. There's no sunset either on the program itself or on the affordability.
So the $100 million has to also cover the purchase price to buy these hotels from whoever owns them.
Yeah. And that could be a lot in this market. But that's why we have to act fast, because the prices are lower now than they were a year ago or 2 years ago.
Right. Now, this is a statewide program. It's not just New York City, right?
Yeah, that's right. That was incredibly important. We had groups in Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, all fighting for this program.
So we need to do another lobbying job next year to get more money put into this program. We also need to put pressure on the Cuomo administration to make sure that this gets implemented and that we actually see these conversions take place. Do you think has there been any discussion with the governor's people about this?
Well, there were negotiations with the governor's people and with the HCR, the state housing agency, when we were crafting the bill, and they proposed some changes, many of which were made, which we understood as them accepting the bill. And so now it's time for Cuomo to sign it. So the first piece of advocacy that needs to be done is keeping the pressure on Cuomo to actually sign this legislation that's been passed through the state Senate and the Assembly. Once he passes it, then you're absolutely right. We have a whole new program that we need to implement. We need to get them to do it and to show that it works, and we need to put more money in it in next year's budget.
Do you think there's a chance the governor would just sit on this $100 million and not spend it? I mean, this is something that's happened in the past with other programs.
Exactly. I don't want to count anything out, but it would be a foolish action to sit on this when we've allocated the money already, when the hotel owners want this program, right? The hotel owners know that they're not all going to come back and they want a way out, and this will do it. So the coalition that supports this includes not just tenants, not just homeless groups, but hotel workers and some hotel owners as well. So I really think it would be wise for the governor to sign it as soon as possible.
Do you have an idea of the timeline when the governor might act on the bill? The last time I checked, it had not been sent to the governor.
That was what I heard yesterday as well. So I don't have any update beyond that.
Because it could be any time between now and December. I mean, the actual legal deadline is December 31st for the governor to act on any bill that was passed in 2021. And right. It's not unusual for a whole slew of bills to get signed in, long about December 20th, right before the Christmas holiday.
And meanwhile, these hotels are not going anywhere. It's not as if they are all bouncing back. Yes, some tourists are coming back, but a lot of these hotels' core industry was not, your everyday tourist, but it was conferences, big international gatherings. Those things are not returning for quite a while. And so it would be a waste to wait. And it would also make the program less effective because presumably the prices will go up over the next 6 months, not down.
Right. Now, one important feature of Honda is that the legislation specifically earmarks these conversions to be done by nonprofit organizations, not profit-making developers. Talk about that and how that, did you have resistance to that?
Sure. The for-profit development world is salivating at the thought of all these empty commercial buildings, especially given some of their locations in very hot real estate climates, even including some of those ones we talked about before that are in somewhat odd manufacturing districts. They might be right next to, say, Long Island City or Gowanus or other hot real estate markets. And so Rebney and the for-profit developers love the idea of getting control of this. And basically their program was, let's do mandatory inclusionary housing for hotels and office buildings. 25% of it will be set aside as affordable, though there was no definition of what that would mean. And the rest, 75%, would be market rate, effectively luxury development. And that was the program that the governor got behind. And he announced after his State of the State address that was his preferred approach to this issue. That luckily, and I think really because we fought for Honda as an alternative vision that was almost too good to turn down, there was no legislation that came out really making that a concrete proposal. And so one of the victories for Honda was making our idea the idea moving forward on how to convert hotels to commercial, and really saying, no, this isn't about giving yet another opportunity for luxury development. This is about solving the crisis where it exists.
Right. I mean, we've been in this syndrome for so many years and de Blasio is as guilty of this as any other mayor, of building shelters, congregate shelters, where you put, dozens or hundreds of people into a barracks-like setting. They have no privacy. They have no security. Many people are afraid to go into these shelters because they consider them dangerous. And instead of building shelters, this would actually create permanent affordable housing. And that's a very important departure. And we've just seen this this week. The de Blasio administration is moving the people that it moved from congregate shelters into hotel rooms because of COVID. Now that COVID infections are down, they've started to move these homeless New Yorkers back into congregate shelters, which is really, really kind of depressing to think about. I mean, to me, it's a huge failure of city government.
Absolutely. It's a tragedy and it's an insult. Moving people out of congregate shelters and into safe conditions, especially during this pandemic, was a major public health initiative. It was also a major leg up for a lot of homeless people who suddenly had access to privacy and dignity and predictability and all sorts of things that are, basic rights, basic guarantees to most people living in the city. Suddenly, basically everybody had that. And now we're going back to a status quo that everybody acknowledged is broken. The mayor builds more shelters while saying he understands that shelter is not the long-term answer.
Right. Then why build them? Why build shelters? Why not build affordable housing?
That's right. You don't build these things unless you're going to fill them.
Yeah. And
so the expectation is homelessness will continue at the levels that it is.
Yeah, right. And of course, this also gets into a question of MIH, mandatory inclusionary housing.
Mm-hmm.
I consider this to be a failure. I actually told Bill de Blasio to his face back in 2014, when we were still on speaking terms, that I did not think MIH was going to work. He just frowned. He didn't want to hear it. But this whole idea that we can bribe profit-making developers to give them huge subsidies to build market rate housing in return for a little bit of trickle down, quote, affordable housing, which is not really affordable. You can accurately say it's below market, the 25% or so that these programs produce, but you can't really describe most of it as affordable.
And it's below the market citywide, but not necessarily in the neighborhoods where it's being implemented.
Exactly.
And so in the local context, it's just more expensive housing.
Right. And we're spending billions of dollars every year subsidizing essentially subsidizing the creation of luxury housing, some of which will just sit empty.
Especially through 421A, which you've talked about many times. That is the single biggest housing program in New York State. It's more than we spend on public housing. It's more than we spend on other forms of affordable housing, and the vast majority of it is luxury housing.
The last time I looked, we were spending, I think, $1.7 billion a year in tax subsidies under the 421A program. And that's just 421A. There's also other programs like J51.
Mm-hmm.
But we're spending, lots of money to subsidize private profit-making developers to create luxury housing in return for the hope that we'll get a little bit of affordable housing out of it. I mean, why do we have to have this argument at this day and age? I mean, trickle down does not work.
Right.
And anyone with any brain knows that. And going down this road.
Yeah, and I think we're going to be having this fight in a very public way in the coming year, because 421A is going to expire 1 year from now. And so it is the right time to be having this fight in public and to be saying we should not be spending $1.7 billion subsidizing luxury housing. To the extent that it creates affordable housing, our mutual and much missed friend Tom Waters did the calculus to say we are spending $1 million per unit on the affordable housing, which is like twice what it costs to just pay a nonprofit developer to build it. And so it's deeply wasteful, and it's subsidizing gentrification all over New York City. And the 485A program is subsidizing gentrification upstate.
Yeah, which is the equivalent program. I mean, and next year, 421A does come up for renewal in the state legislature, and the tenant movement is pretty determined to get rid of it once and for all and to redirect that money into truly affordable housing programs.
Right. And think about Honda, right? We put $100 million into it. That is a good seed, but it's not much on the scale of New York City real estate. Meanwhile, 421A has gotten about $100 million more expensive every year for the past few years. So that's just the cost of that one program which subsidizes luxury development. That's how much we put into this great new program for deeply and permanently affordable housing. We need to flip those priorities.
Yeah, and of course we're up against very powerful enemies, the Real Estate Board of New York, REBNY, and the real estate industry in general. They have a lot of power. Their power comes from their money. Their money comes from the rents that we pay them, and we should never forget that. And of course, their power has diminished to a considerable degree now that the Democrats have taken control of the state Senate, and you have both a state assembly and state Senate that are controlled by the Democrats. And both of those houses now have a super majority of Democrats, which means they could override a veto by the governor if they needed to do that. And that's a very big sea change in Albany. It's led to, for example, 2 years ago, the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which was a major tenant victory. It led to, in 2021, finally raising taxes on the rich after years of trying and failing because of opposition from the governor. And of course, Andrew Cuomo is weaker than he was because of all the scandals surrounding him. And legislators aren't afraid of him anymore. They used to be pretty much afraid of him like 10 years ago, but that's not the case anymore. So this is going to be an interesting fight next year, and we're going to certainly have to get more money into Honda, and because it is a mechanism to create actual permanent affordable housing that is affordable and that will help get people off the streets and out of congregate shelters. And some of it's going to be, actually, I think, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, Honda provides that, the bill provides that these units will be rent stabilized.
That's right. This is rent stabilized full apartments. It's not shelters. It's not traditional SROs in that every unit will have a kitchenette and a bathroom. And yeah, it's rent stabilized. 50% of it is for folks who are currently homeless, but the other 50% is just for low-income New Yorkers who need good housing. And so this will provide that housing, and it will provide it all over in neighborhoods all over the city, basically any place that has a hotel or an office building that is suitable for conversion. So we think it's a really important precedent moving forward for how to change the state's priorities. And it's possible for exactly the political dynamic that you laid out. Because the Democrats have that supermajority, because the state legislature is feeling emboldened, we can do things like this now.
And this is really social housing when you get right down to it. And we need, one thing we do need is more social housing, more public housing, more Mitchell-Lama housing, etc. So Sam,
Yeah.
thank you so much. This has been very interesting. Congratulations again.
Thank you very much.
Terrific victory. And we'll be keeping our eye on how this gets played out and how Honda gets implemented. But it's a very encouraging development, and we really do appreciate your efforts and the efforts that Community Service Society put into this.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for having me on the show.
Okay, talk soon.
Take care.
Finally, we're going to talk to two representatives of Vocal New York. Vocal was the lead organization behind the enactment of Honda. They did a terrific job of lobbying and advocating and organizing for this legislation. Many other organizations were involved also, including Housing Justice for All. But we're going to be talking to Althea Williams, who is a member of the Homeless Union of Vocal New York, and Paulette Soltani, who is the political director. Althea Williams, Paulette Soltani, welcome to Tenant Action Today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for allowing me, Paulette, to ask me.
And congratulations on Honda. This is a really terrific victory.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank
Yes,
you for
it
having
is.
us.
And you know, Vocal was the lead group that pushed this through. I mean, this is a feather in your cap. Tell us about how this came about. Where did this idea come from? How did you develop it? And how did you push it through the legislature?
Sure. So Vocal New York has been working on housing issues since we were founded. So we were founded as the New York AIDS Housing Network over 20 years ago. And working on homelessness and issues around housing instability has been a pillar of our organization. And so we've been fighting around these issues. And when we saw the pandemic hit, we fought really, really hard to move thousands of people in New York City out of these congregate crowded shelters and into hotel rooms. And once we actually succeeded at winning a lot of those moves, and I should say that not everybody was actually moved and not everybody was protected, but 10,000 people here in New York City were moved, and our leaders and our members started to say, like, why are we going to go back? Why we should never go back to congregate settings. In fact, we should demand that these places that are underutilized actually be converted into permanent housing. And so the Honda bill was born out of our membership's demands, and it makes sense in this moment. We worked really hard with our own membership, with our allies who've been in support of this. Community Service Society, the Hotel Trades Council were big parts of the push around this, the Housing Justice for All Coalition. And so there was a lot of support from the beginning, because it just makes no sense to have unoccupied space while thousands and thousands of people are in need of housing across our city and across our state, which I think we want to talk about a little bit more today too. It's not just a New York City issue, it's New York State.
So members of your homeless union actually developed this legislation.
Right. And I think Althea can speak more to that piece.
Althea, you're one of the leaders of the homeless union.
Yes, I am. I'm part of the homeless union. Homelessness is something I've been advocating for years, along with tenants' rights and just the injustices. You know, it's so many, you have to balance yourself because there's so many that's out there and a lot of services that need to be done.
And you yourself live in a shelter, I believe.
I do live in a shelter. I've been there since December 2019 from a fire. And there's no real work. I'm a working individual taxpayer. And people have a stigma about people in the shelter. I'm not on no drugs. You know, I'm a taxpayer. and they focus on the people who are mentally ill and highlight the negative instead of the good people that resides at the temporary shelter.
And people don't often realize there are many, many people living in shelters who are going to work every day, holding down jobs, and there's thousands of children living in shelters who go to school every day. I mean, it's really kind of obscene that we're putting up with this. I mean, and instead of building housing, the city keeps building shelters, and de Blasio is
And,
as guilty of that as any mayor. Uh, we
and
need to get away from the shelter model.
And just like my niece, she just had a baby. Her and her husband lost their jobs, and they in the shelter in Times Square. And she just had the baby a week ago, so they want to put them in. I don't know how the family dynamic goes, but just to take them out of their environment where they not congregated with nobody, and just to put them back in the shelter system, I don't know what's to expect with that. I think the city is going backwards and not moving forward. This is a great opportunity with this Honda bill to keep the people where they're at and work with the city FEPS voucher that was just passed to increase, that had increased the voucher to fair market rate. This is a great opportunity to transition them into permanent housing. I don't get it why. Furthermore, from my understanding, the city is already paid up until September. Why rush them out the hotel? Why? What is the rush? Take the time, use the voucher, which is supposed to be in effect in a few more months. It says 6 months from May. And so they can transition people that's there and put them into permanent housing. What bothered me was when I read that the mayor, they was spending, I don't know whether the mayor, they were spending taxpayers' money, $1 million a day to house these individuals. I don't get it, the waste of money. And like I had made a quote before, that we still need a comprehensive plan to create even more nonprofit housing. And we are never going to solve the problem until we stop seeing it as a business. It's really, and until we do that, nothing's going to change. We had this issue for years before this pandemic, and it's gotten worse. Once someone has stable housing, they can focus on other avenues of their life. That's stability. And when you don't have no stability, nothing is going to happen. I work with people in the street. I do harm reduction every day, with people in the street, the marginalized community, about harm reduction. And their most issue is they don't have stability, not at all. And
And
they
you,
don't have identification, they don't have insurance, and which is another issue. And so, I mean, I can go on, because if we want them to, even harm reduction is not about absence, but it can lead to absence. But we can still offer, we have, after we encourage them not to use or not to share they syringes, or they sniffer kit, or they smoker. This is reduced harm from them contacting or giving HIV or AIDS, and then also to dispense they their paraphernalia in a proper container so it can protect the community, as myself. But when they want to go to a program, they don't have insurance, and I believe it should be universal. That's another issue, you know. But I just need to put it out there, because if people have stability, I can't stress that enough. And with this Honda bill, instead of putting people where they was at, just staying more stable, people can start going to the doctor. They can start focus on education, just having peace by themselves, to be able to go and shower. And now, if being there for over a year in the hotel, now limit to 2 bags. So what are they going to do with their other stuff that they accumulate? Because now they felt a little comfortable. They was able to go and buy new clothes, and then the city telling them they can't bring those clothes or whatever new product they bought. This is ridiculous. So they recommend the city need to pause and just wait and utilize these vouchers to get people into permanent housing.
But
That's my
instead,
opinion.
instead the city's moving the 10,000 people back out of hotels, back into congregate shelters.
Doesn't make sense.
Happening this week. It's really, to me, it's a scandal, and I think Bill de Blasio should be ashamed of himself. Just putting people in a hotel room for a year or 15 months has given them stability.
Yes, yes.
One thing, Michael, you said that the issue of like the record of our homelessness crisis in New York State, before the pandemic even hit, there were 92,000 people that were homeless across our state. And in December in New York City, our city hit a new record of single adult homelessness, which was 20,000 people living in the shelters. And at that time, I think people remember seeing these horrific pictures of people laying on the ground of the intake shelter with no bed, nowhere to actually sleep, because there was the homelessness crisis had hit such a startling level. And so we think now with the pandemic, with evictions they've already happened. Illegal evictions are happening. The moratorium will end. All of this is about to get worse. And so, a lot of Vocal's work has been around uniting tenant demands and our work around homelessness, because these things are so interconnected. We have to keep people in their homes, and we have to be fighting to put people back in homes.
Right. And Honda does point a way to the future. I mean, it does. It's $100 million. It's not a lot of money. Mike Gennaro, the lead sponsor in the Senate, describes the $100 million as seed money. We just read this week that the state of California has allocated another $6 billion to amplify and expand their already existing program, where they're converting hotels all over the state into permanent housing for homeless Californians. And California actually has more homeless than New York.
Yes, I seen them when I'm out there. I seen them. Even in Las Vegas, where I came from, it's a lot of homeless people out there.
Yeah, and they're building permanent housing, and we're still stuck in New York City in this congregate shelter model, which let's hope we can get away from that and put a lot more money into this program next year, because $100 million is not going to convert a lot of hotels into permanent housing. What do you think in terms of, do you think the governor is going to actually allow this program to get implemented? And, it wouldn't be the first time that a governor, not just this governor, but any governor, when the legislature appropriates money, sometimes they just decide to sit on it and not spend it and roll it over into next year. Do you think there's enough pressure on Andrew Cuomo for him to actually allow this program to go forward and get implemented?
I think we have to build more pressure. I think your guess is as good as mine with this governor. I think there's one highlight was that he, at the beginning of session in January, in his proposed budget, he did propose hotel conversions as a part of his budget without allocating any money towards it. So he's signaled that he supports some program that would do this kind of thing. But of course, we know that would create more luxury housing than anything else. And so I think our fear is either he vetoes the bill, but more likely is that he'll try to amend the bill with chapter amendments and water it down and kind of gut it, because the real meat of this bill, like you said, there's not a lot of money, but what we've created is a really, really strong program and guardrails on how to use money to create homeless housing. I mean, 50% of this house, at least 50% of what would be created would go to homeless households, and the rest would be for very low income and moderate income people. And so if that is changed in any way, then this becomes a totally different bill.
And it's
And so
permanent affordable housing.
permanent affordable
And
housing.
yeah, it will be rent stabilized, and it will be the conversions will be done by nonprofit organizations, not by profit making developers. So it's a very important protection.
Right.
But we know this governor in particular is very close to the real estate industry and would be inclined to give them what they want. And of course, REBNY, the Real Estate Board of New York, and the private profit-making developers, are looking at all these empty hotels and these empty office buildings, and just drooling over, waiting to get their hands on them. But let's hope we can move this forward. There's a huge amount of support for Honda, not just community groups, and it's a statewide program, so this will benefit the entire state ultimately. But a lot of labor unions, including the Hotel Trades Council, are supporting the bill. And they have a lot of power with the governor, the union. So that gives me some hope.
Absolutely.
Well, like Andrea's student cousin, she was saying the state should finance the purchases and the conversion of vacant properties to prevent permanent housing, by the nonprofit organization. So she's on board, as well as Carl Hesse, the Speaker of the House. He knows that the Honda would help, eliminate some of the housing issues. So I just don't understand why the governor don't see the vision. He talk about it, but he needs to start putting some stuff in and use that pen, and get it going.
Yeah, the danger was, of course, that when they put $100 million into the budget for hotel conversions, but did not pass Honda, that would leave the control of this money and how to spend it entirely up to the governor. But now that the bill has passed, and assuming that the governor signs it, they can't implement it any other way than what the bill calls for. So this is, I read the bill and I was amazed that we got something so good through the legislature with so many. Even some Republicans voted for it, although a lot of the Republicans voted against it. And I believe in the Senate, all of the Democrats voted yes. But in the Assembly, we lost some Democrats, but it still passed overwhelmingly. And as you say, Althea, both Carl Hasty and Andrea Stewart Cousins were very supportive of this. So, it's good to win something, and it's good to win something that actually is going to work. And I think this is a major, major victory.
We are so proud of this bill, and it will help so many, many people. I mean, and even with the mental health, with the stability, maybe they can start a medication, be more productive, Sometimes you can go in the shelter and of sound mind, and just through the bureaucracy of the experience, and it can bring you down. It can make you depressed. And so, yes, this will help. And this will help get people off the street. I mean, once we have this permanent housing for those that's there, which is thousands of people, then we can move and get more people into permanent housing. It's a way. We've been fighting the homeless crisis too long, couple decades, too long, and we got the money. And like I said, until they stop making it as a business, it will work. The money is there. It's there. They just have to do the right thing for the people of New York. It's there.
One other thing, I think for us, this signals a big step forward in terms of policy, because it is just sound policy that was based in what people were demanding, that were facing homelessness, facing this crisis head on. But the second piece of it, I think, is that it is a huge acknowledgement on behalf of the legislature that this crisis even exists, because we have been chipping away trying to make any progress for years. And to pass legislation like this makes it so much more possible for us to imagine passing more in the future. And it's truly just an acknowledgement that finally our state leaders and the legislature is willing to do something about something so big that the governor has created, number one, and number two, every single year has lied about his own commitments, his own progress on the issue.
Yeah. And,
But
you
I
know,
just don't want the bill to sit there. I want them to start with the action.
Right. We need to.
And that means no one leaves this hotel. No one, unless they have a voucher. You know, you can start with the increase of the vouchers. You know, for those who might need extra space. You know, for a single individual, I believe it could be good for them to stay where they at.
We're going to need. Yeah, we're going to need to, based on everything Althea is saying, we're going to have to grow this program come January, fight for more funding to grow Honda, hopefully get federal money that's coming down from the next infrastructure bill. And then on top of it, Althea's bringing up some rental assistance programs. A big part of what we're going to be fighting for next year is around a bill called the Housing Access Voucher Program. And all of these things need to work together to put people back into homes and keep them there.
right. Yeah. And the city did increase the value of the city voucher.
Right.
The city council did that recently over the opposition of Mayor de Blasio. And that's going to make a big difference because the value of the voucher was so far below market that people who were given these vouchers could not find an apartment because it wouldn't cover the rent. And now people, let's hope, will actually be able to get an apartment that the voucher will cover. So it's all interconnected.
Yes. But this is not only helping, because you know, Boca have an upstate as well. And what we do downstate, we want it upstate as well, in Rochester, Buffalo, and Albany, and Yonkers, you know, Westchester. You know, it should be New York State and not just New York City.
And
you know, this is for all the people.
One of your staff members, Kim Smith, has now been elected to the Rochester City Council. That's really great news.
Yes.
Yeah.
Two of them. Our other coworker, Stanley Martin. She's our.
I didn't realize he was with Focal. That's great.
Yeah.
That's going to make a big difference in Rochester.
It is.
Yeah. So thank you, guys. Thank you, Althea. Thank you, Paulette.
Thank you so much.
And this is really great news and good work.
Thank you so much for having us. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You've been watching Tenant Action Today. We're on every Wednesday from 6 to 7 p.m. Thanks for watching, and please tune in again next week.